which is my grandmother's language. Although I'm enrolled with the Umatilla tribe through my father's family, with also Klamath Modoc, and my mother's family is Coeur d'Alene, and welcome. My background is Southwest Washington in the homelands of Cowlitz and Chinook tribe. Tatskalap. Good afternoon. Katsiaya. Thank you for giving us this third session to share ideas, innovation, knowledge, and the blooming relationship. Thanks and appreciation for all the work with everyone preparing this workshop and for your attendance. The purpose of our tribal blessing and thoughts is to provide another transition point for our minds and hearts to reflect and step into a new day and grow together in a community network that was new and will be renewed after today. This blessing and transition is to provide hope to mend our fractured forest, range, grasslands, people, and connecting Western science with traditional knowledges from thousands of years of symbiotic relationships and language. Today, the journey returns with caretakers listening and continuing to work in the sessions. We hope the advice has created a story arc with emotional beats that includes some humor for the caretakers that are needed to mend our dynamic communities. We now have a wonderful opportunity to return on our journey as caretakers, and at the end of our sessions, we can return to our communities and share our new gifts of knowledge and innovations, evolving long relationships to create a mighty network and a better society. Katsiaya, thank you for giving us this day together.
Thank you so much, Don. I'll go ahead and share my screen so we can do a little bit of an introduction. I know there are always just one or two people who may not have been in the previous days, so I want to make sure that we're making it accessible for everyone. So welcome back to the third day and the last day of the summit. However, it's certainly not the last day of our time together. It's really the first day of continuing on in this discussion and network. I'm guessing a lot of you have seen this slide before, so this is a friendly reminder for those of you who are able. Please do change your Zoom name to your full name and association. During presentations, please do keep yourself muted and use the Zoom chat to answer any questions or ask any questions of the presenters. For our presenters today, I'll be monitoring the chat and helping to facilitate the Q&A, so I'll be able to keep an eye on those. And during the breakout room sessions later today, please make sure that everyone is listening actively, respecting others' points of view, and allowing everyone a chance to speak. The Northwest Innovative Forestry Summit is building on really a long and sometimes underappreciated history of experimentation and innovation in the Pacific Northwest, and we're so excited to be able to continue these conversations with all of you today and also in the future. One of the ways that we'll be continuing on in those conversations is in the Mighty Network, and I'd love to turn it over to Maura to tell us a little bit more about that. Maura?
Hello, everyone, and thanks for joining us again today on our third day. It's been a really great venture so far, a lot of great discussions and a lot of great questions. And just want to remind everyone that the Mighty Networks is here to build upon this community and to continue connections. And we do have, I wanted to highlight the community news and highlights topic within Mighty Networks. This is where you can really have some fun in maybe sharing a day out in the woods, an article that you really enjoyed or thought others would enjoy, research, if there's any questions or polls. I'm not sure if that's open to everyone, but it's a place where we can start questions and discussions along with the other topics that are there to add. Hopefully, could you change the next slide, Ron? So as we continue after the summit, this is really the opportunity. Where are we going to go next? And we're really hoping to use this Mighty Networks platform to strengthen our connections. And part of the little carrot that we're going to have for you is we will be posting the recordings of all the days of sessions and presentations within Mighty Networks, and then any additional accompanying readings or something that the presenters may want to share. And then additionally, you have, you can continue to comment on this. And I think we're also going to try to bring up some of the questions that were not answered and maybe continue our discussions and within Mighty Network. So I highly encourage you, if you haven't yet become a member within Mighty Networks, go ahead and do this. This is a closed platform for right now. So again, there's no ads. This is a small network, well, a small of 180 maybe for all those attending the session. So you can, this is here to continue our conversation. And I think we had one little quick question. You can just show with a raise of hands or a reaction of sorts, but if anyone might be interested in us providing a short video, 1 to 2 minutes on how to really use the network, feel free to throw a hand in or applause or however, so that we have an idea of what you would like to see. But hopefully we're going to take your guidance on where we want to take this network, but mostly we just want the discussions to continue.
Great, thank you, Maura. All right, and I think without further ado, we can go ahead and get started with some of our wonderful presenters today. We have 4 presenters today, but only 3 speakers, and that's not actually an April Fool's joke. One of our presenters, Cindy Glick, who is a retired federal forester based in Oregon, is unfortunately off the grid, or fortunately for her, I suppose, given how wonderful the weather is this week up in the Northwest. But she's off the grid this week, but very kindly pre-recorded her presentation, and we're going to be making that available to everyone immediately after the talks today, so that everyone can hear what she has to say. And she told me her themes for her presentation were "Let's talk" and "Where's the money?" So definitely encourage everyone to take a listen to what Cindy has to say in her presentation as well. And then live for our speakers, we're going to kick off with Seth Zuckerman from Northwest Natural Resource Group. Seth is the executive director of NNRG and has been working along the West Coast and in the Northwest for about 25 years, both in resource and also in communications. So excited to hear what he has to say about economics of thinning. So Seth, go ahead once I stop my sharing so that you can share yours. And I'll be monitoring the chats for any questions that folks have. Go ahead, Seth.
All right, thank you so much, Rowan. And you know, with Zoom, it's always, one always hopes, crosses one's fingers, hoping that it's all going to work out properly. I'm hoping you're seeing my PowerPoint and that now you're seeing not my notes, but the actual presentation. Is that so? Yes, all right.
We are seeing your notes, Seth, so you might want to shift it to full screen.
Full screen. Oh, sorry. I thought, I really was quite certain that we had had this all wired ahead of time. Let's see. So we're on full screen now. Try new share.
Full screen.
All right. Well, thank you for bearing with me. And April Fools, everyone. And thank you to the organizers of the Northwest Innovative Forestry Summit, which I hope will be the first of many Northwest Innovative Forestry Summits, for inviting this presentation from NNRG about the work that we've been doing in collaboration with Oregon State and EcoTrust on the question of how well the alternative silviculture and harvest methods can pay off. So we started this study a few years back with the questions of, can alternative silviculture be profitable, and what circumstances would make it more or less financially attractive? I feel a bit sheepish talking about money after all the conversation yesterday about carbon and native foods and water. I feel a bit tawdry, actually. And then the day before, hearing about servicing the ecosystem and asking not what you can do, what your forest can do for you, but what you can do for your forest. So I tried to find some solace in poetry, and went back to the words of Jerry Martine, who's a poet from Humboldt County, where I used to live in Northern California. And in his poem, The End of the Fiscal Year, he says, "It will turn out that money was just another kind of love we thought we could live without." So, you know, money isn't everything, but it has its uses. And land stewardship costs money. You have to pay the taxes, maintain the roads, monitor the forest, perhaps update your management plan every now and again, remove invasives. And the forest needs you to take care of these things, right? You don't want and hopefully it will ultimately be able to pay for itself, because you don't want the ecological forest to still be living in your basement when it's 40 years old, right? It should carry its own weight. And then hopefully even beyond that, it might provide a modest return so that a person who buys and holds the forest will, if they're patient, find enough payback that they're not tempted to liquidate it when they have a financial need. You know, we're not talking about lucrative returns such as you might have if you bought Bitcoin or shares of GameStop, but just a sort of a get rich slow sort of scheme that might sustain you over time, even as you're also sustaining the forest. So that was the animating question that brought up this research project, which was hatched as a collaboration between Klaus Putman and my predecessor, Dan Stonington, quite some time ago. I believe it was when a certain reality TV star was having some surprising success in the Republican primary in 2016, if you can remember back to that era. So it's been a bit of a relay race since then. Our former director of programs, Lindsay Malone, worked on this, and now Rowan Braybrook is. And on the OSU side, Klaus and his colleague, Professor Olli-Pekka Kusala, which I'm hoping I'm pronouncing right, have been involved in both the design of the study and in analyzing its results. So what I'd like to do today is just share a little bit about what we've learned, even as we're not far into the analysis of the results, tell you a little bit about how we conducted the study and what we've learned about factors that influence the profitability of alternative forms of silviculture. So we started off with a study that was, I must say, perhaps comprehensive to a fault. The pages you see here from the study are just 2 of the 23 pages that we asked participants to fill out, either online or on SurveyMonkey or on paper. And nearly 150 people started the survey. 101 made it past the first page, and 83 actually finished, partly due to the fact that we were able to offer a $50 gift card as an incentive for people to make it all the way through. We tried to cast a pretty broad net of not just people who are in our networks or on our mailing lists, but also using the Oregon Small Woodlands Association network, as well as lists of people who had filed forest practices applications in Washington and soliciting them to fill out these applications so we wouldn't just be talking to people within the same bubble. But our overall hope with the survey was to gain a sense of the range of financial outcomes that people could have if they're choosing not to just clear cut and liquidate the forest, but instead to harvest it more selectively, or at least within the bounds of ecological forestry. And the people who responded to our survey or the harvest that they were conducting, they spanned a wide range of stand ages, from some very young stands under 30 years old that were probably seeing their first entry thinning, all the way to 60 or 80, and then some mixed age stands. The harvest types were also fairly diverse. There were some clear cuts that were mainly, I believe, aimed at reinitiating stands that had gotten stuck or perhaps were not adequately stocked. There were equally spaced thinnings, selection harvests, variable density thinnings, shelter woods, and then one that just didn't fit into any category. Through these harvests, we asked about the pre and post harvest stockings. They often were not harvesting so much that they moved the forest from one category, or the stand from one category of density to another. So quite a few of these 200 to 300 tree per acre stands, quite a few of the 100 to 200 tree per acre stands remained 100 to 2 acre tree per acre stands afterwards. That's this chunk here. Some went down a category. The 200 to 300 went down a category for the most part, though a few remained in the 2 to 300 bracket, and so on. So they were managing and affecting the density of the forest. Harvested species dominated by the ever popular Douglas fir, and with some components of whitewoods, big leaf maple, and red alder, and much less of the other species. And then here we get to the slide that answers one of the key questions that we started with, which was, what sort of positive financial results can you expect if you thin your forest? One of the imagined or straw person arguments that's often thrown up against thinning is, well, you're going to be leaving a lot of value on behind, and you're not really going to make enough money by thinning to justify going to all the trouble. And so what we see in this collection of results here is that although, yes, you can make more money by clear cutting your forest because you're basically liquidating its value all at once, you still can get a positive net income through these other methods of thinning or selection harvest. And if you're not familiar with the box and whisker plot format, the thick line in the middle represents the median value. The top and bottom of the box are the 75th and 25th percentile of the respondents in that category. And then the top and the bottom of the whiskers represent how far they represent sort of the extremes, although not the outliers. By age class, when you divide up the net income by age class and then by harvest method, you can see that there's a lot of variability, which again shows that just because you're thinning, you're not necessarily consigning yourself to a much lower outcome or profitability than you would if you had gone to the chosen a clear cut instead. And what I think is also noteworthy is, as you go from the from the younger ages at the top to the lower ages, you see a general trend, as you'd expect, towards higher profitability in terms of net income per acre. Wide range of hauling distances, and as you'd expect, the farther you have to haul your logs, the higher the hauling cost per 1,000 board feet. We have a couple of case studies, but am I to understand, Colleen, that the fact that you're standing up means I should wrap up? Is that right?
No, not at all. I'm not a time person. Rowan is. I'm just uncomfortable sitting.
Oh, okay. That's great. Well, then I will be able to mention at least one, if not both, of the case studies. So we have just to start out, a Western Washington landowner with several thousand acres, whose long-term goals, as you can see, were around biodiversity and resilience to climate change and income. Told us about a harvest of theirs that spanned 48 acres in their 40 to 60-year-old forest. This is the sort of forest in which it's an enviable forest to be operating in, right? And so it's no surprise that they were able to wind up with quite a bit of profitability. And here, these dots help you compare their result, which is this little green dot here, against what some of their peers were able to reap as harvest, as gross income per acre. So they're near the top of, one of the more fortunate of the forests in their age category. With 87% saw logs, they had a more valuable harvest than most, and made this much in gross revenue. About half of that, as we'll see, went to logging costs. And so but that still was fairly typical, and so their net income remains fairly high compared to their peers. Because it was mostly a saw timber harvest, again, that helped them keep their net income among the higher category. And they benefited from short skidding distances, which of course is going to make the logging cost lower, the logging more efficient and therefore less costly. So after putting together this kind of case study, we've been thinking about the fact that the plural of anecdotes is not data. And so we're trying to think about how are we going to represent this so that people can make use of it. And on the academic side, Klaus and Olli-Pekka are working on some more, what should I say, statistically valid forms of analysis. But we're trying to figure out how to portray these case studies in ways that practitioners will be able to use anecdotally. And so, and we'd love some feedback on this approach that we've put together, which is to sort out the case studies into ones that resemble the forest stand that you're looking at. And so the first category is stand age, and the second category is slope, because obviously that's going to determine whether you can easily use ground-based equipment for logging or not. And then compare the case study that we're presenting against its peers, and not against a forest that might be much older or more valuable or steeper, that wouldn't be representative. And so I'll just briefly present a second case study here. Again, a relatively large landowner in the Puget Sound region, also with goals that had a lot more to do with the health of the forest and restoring stand structure and function than with simply making a cash income. Their forest was under 40 years old, almost all dug fir, and they undertook a variable density thinning on this relatively gentle slope. And from that, they were able to remove about just over 1 truckload per acre of logs. Their gross income, $180,000, which came down to a net of $75,000 after they paid for logging and hauling. Where does that stack up compared to others? So in this graph, the red dot is the case study I'm just describing. The blue dots are others that fall into this same category of gentle slopes of forests under 40 years old. And the gray dots are everyone else. So you can see their logging cost was fairly typical. And by harvest, comparing it to others who use the same harvest type, also fairly typical per this bottom scale here per 1,000 board feet. But I'll just go back and say that if you are trying to make use of this data, you'd be cautioned to note that there can be a wide range from $100 to $600 or $700 per 1,000, depending on the situation and exact circumstances and the logger that you find. Right? Their net income, right in the middle of the pack for a variable density thinning of these in this blue cohort of people in their same circumstances. And the takeaway here is from both of these case studies is that thinning rather than liquidating your forest it can be a financially viable option. And so don't let anyone tell you different, right? many factors, all the ones that I've named, all matter. And I didn't show any case studies like this, but what we found is that at under 30 years old, thinning can pay for forest improvement, but it really won't yield a lot of net income. So it can pay for its own self-improvement, but you probably won't wind up with a lot in your pocket after it's all said and done. So I would just ask that you stay in touch. We love feedback on this study as we work on it. Here's some of the key players involved. You've seen many of them on screen during the course of this 3-day extravaganza. And thank you very much. I'll hand it back to Rowan.
Great, thank you, Seth. And we have just a few moments for some questions. And I saw a few comments already populated in the chats, which is good since as I'm part of the group that's working on this project, I'm not exactly a neutral party when it comes to questioning, so I can't really ask any casual neutral conversations. But I did want to convey a question from Josh, who was wondering, were most or all of the comparison harvest clear cuts for the comparisons between the types of logging and thinning?
No, I think clear cuts amounted to about a dozen of the 80 or so responses. Most of the rest were thinnings of various kinds or selection harvests.
And for case study 1, were any of the wetlands part of the property? And if so, was it possible for the landowner to use FREP to qualify for timber value income without a harvest at all?
Well, so the surveys that we did were entirely confidential, and we didn't follow up with people. So I'm not able to really answer that question, but it's a really good one. I'd be curious to know that.
Yeah, and I think to editorialize a little bit, a lot of the analysis that we've been working on with this project is trying to balance the value of case studies versus the value of larger data, because so many things are very dependent on the individual case, the individual ecosystem and location that, trying to figure out some of the outcomes for some of the noise of the data has been challenging, but very interesting given the experiences that landowners shared with us. It looks like we're about at time, so I wanted to shift gears a bit to our next presenter. However, if folks want to add any more questions either to the chat or into Mighty Networks, we'll be able to come back and answer those in the conversations that continue after the summit. But we want to shift gears a little bit to talk with Mark Miller from Trout Mountain Forestry. Mark has been a forestry consultant for, I believe, over 30 years. He's a 4th generation Oregonian and also has done some work in Maine, but is back in Oregon and has been living in Corvallis for a number of years. So just down the road from my sister, actually. So Mark, I'd love to turn it over to you to hear your presentation.
All right, thank you, Rowan. Let's try this.
Looks great.
All right. Well, thank you. I'm honored to be asked to speak to you today. I've been inspired by the great variety and wisdom of the other speakers these past 3 days. I hope that I can provide you with a few new insights, ways of thinking about innovation and silviculture. Trout Mountain Forestry is a consulting firm that was established in 2006. We're based in Portland and Corvallis. We work throughout Northwest Oregon and Southwest Washington. Our clients include family forest land, community forests, both public, municipal, and landowner groups, and various nonprofits. Our clients are a diverse group. They share some key attributes. Probably most important is that income is important, but it's not the most important thing. So when I was asked to speak today and learn my topic was multi-generational silviculture, I'll admit that I scratched my head a little bit. it's a pretty open-ended topic. It could be interpreted in a number of different ways. The first, of course, is that silviculture can be used to create diverse multi-aged forests, or it could be about silviculture as it's been practiced by generations of foresters, or maybe forestry as practiced on a piece of land over time by succeeding generations of a family as their needs, objectives, and situations change. I think each of these is pertinent to this week's summit. I'll briefly try to touch on each of them, sharing the example of trout mountain forestry and our firm's history and development and how our silviculture has changed over time, and conclude with a brief case study from one of our client owners. So Trout Mountain Forestry has only a 15-year history, but our silvicultural practice has a 60-year history. And it's been, I think, uniquely pretty consistent over that whole time. Our goals or philosophy, the bottom line is that we respect all the values of the forest. We don't practice industrial forestry. We use innovative silviculture that's matched to the unique characteristics of the site and ownership situation. We are careful to give as much concern to what's left as what's taken, and we keep our future options open by encouraging multi-species, multiple ages, and protecting all the properties, resource values. We like to think of our work as spanning 3 generations. And Dick Smith was an early consultant, a pioneer in selection thinning. Some may have heard of him in his work through the 60s, 70s, into the 80s. He was never a part of Trout Mountain Forestry, but we think of him as a grandfather figure. He was a mentor, actually a business partner to Scott Ferguson late in his career. One of my 2 original partners in Trout Mountain Forestry. The second generation is Scott, Barry Sims, and myself, starting in our individual consulting practices in the 80s, 90s, into the 2000s. We shared values in our forestry approaches. We did some early collaborations, and in 2006 formed Trout Mountain Forestry to pool our efforts and put our heads together. And then the next generation, Mike Messier, Matt Fehrenbacher, Shane Hetzler, Mindy Laird Garcia, joined through the 2010s, brought in new blood, new skills, but the same consistent set of values. To understand how our work's evolved over the years and the silvicultural innovations that we and others have developed or used, it's important to remember the changing nature of forests and the industry over the past decades, the context and constraints that everyone was really operating under. And this isn't news, but I think it's worth taking a moment to review this big picture over time. The 60s and 70s were, of course, a large log economy, mostly older trees, larger trees being cut. The forests were really different from today's forests. They're generally forests that naturally regenerated after clear cutting, World War II and after, the giant housing boom after, and a lot of ongoing agricultural abandonment. At the time, there were markets only for larger logs, 16 inches and up often, and lumber was really low valued. The logging costs were low, and that made the industry really viable. It was large and diverse. Some of the innovations, especially on small private tracts that occurred during that time, was a high thinning approach that Dick Smith and some others pioneered. And that was developed largely because those larger logs were the only ones that were saleable. And it was an approach that was, when applied well, was a light periodic thinning, really trying to release some of those subdominant trees, and relying on natural regeneration where they could, just because planting was fairly new, experimental, and in the attempt to keep costs low. Through the 80s and 90s, of course, were the concerns over old growth harvest and spotted owl, the timber wars. The forests at that time were primarily these second growth forests that were maturing, as well as some of the earlier plantations that were getting to harvestable size. Because of the restriction of old growth harvest and just the changing industry, now smaller logs were marketable. Lumber values were really high, actually some of the highest they've been in the last 60 years in real dollars. But logging costs were still low. And so some of the innovations, again, thinking mostly about small lands, were the development of different thinning regimes, selection thinning, variable density thinning, and some work around uneven aged management. Through the 2000s, of course, rapidly increasing mechanization of logging, globalization of markets. The forest continued to change, most harvest coming from plantations, and even second and some third growth plantations. These were pure Douglas fir stands with not a lot of variability, very few legacies. The mills becoming very efficient, especially in smaller logs, able to sell logs down to 5 inches. But values were low, especially in real dollars, and logging costs were high. And so that made margins really tight, something that continues to this day. And we started to see two different things, increasing in our forests, increasing interest and concern for rare species and natural systems, process and function. And then in the markets, we started to see emerging grants and cost share for restoration. So innovations that occurred during this period, variable retention harvesting, ways to regenerate stands at low cost, close to even clear cutting cost, but still leave or increase the structure, as well as work around restoration. And that's in a lot of different realms: older forest restoration, oak, prairies, stream restorations. And we started to see emergence of things like conservation easements, land protection, and carbon. And all of these brought different new sources of income in non-timber markets. So I want to talk a little bit about one of our client properties as an example, Shiver River property that is outside of Philomath. That's been family owned for 100 years, had a real consistent management approach, 4 generations of owners, and basic values of sustaining the property and the family. Especially concerned, no clear cuts, and really interested in songbirds, habitat in general, enhancing habitats and really maintaining those other non-timber values. And so some of our practices over time, we can consider them innovations, although they weren't necessarily brand new, but a long history of thinning, initially a lot of high thinning, and made possible by dry sites here and prolific natural regeneration. Uneven age management, started to become possible, at least on this property. And there were some studies that went on in the early 2000s. Variable retention, while it wasn't an innovation, it was a new practice that we used here, relatively new, when we found that some of the thinning had run its limits, and we were seeing dieback from climate change on some of the drier sites. Then in the 2000s as well, and 2010s, getting involved in different restoration practices around prairie plants, around oak, around stream improvements. And these all brought partners in, and with leveraging funds, able to make these practices more economical. Still involved investments, but they were doable. And what that did was really build pride in ownership, and really helped build community as well. So I'll wrap up and just say that each property and situation is unique, but I think one of the things that's really common is that objectives and constraints, they will change over time. And silviculture can be relevant if it maintains options, and really to apply silviculture in a creative and innovative way requires an intimate knowledge of the land and how the land responds to management. So thank you. And maybe we have time for questions.
Yeah, we certainly have time for a few, and it looks like some have already popped up in the chat. So thank you for sharing those, and you can share other questions in the chat. Klaus was wondering, can you discuss the role of natural disturbances, for example, the Columbus Day storm, in leading to heterogeneous stand structures?
Well, the Columbus Day storm is certainly a major player here in stand structures on this property. That was really what started the forest management era on this property that was originally agriculture land. And that natural disturbance and the salvage logging that followed from it did start the first wave of natural regeneration. So yeah, natural disturbances do play a major role.
And Greg was wondering, with the Sugar River property, is that the one that was included in the paper that you wrote with Emmingham? Can selection thinning convert even age Douglas fir stands to uneven age stands?
Yes, it is exactly that paper. And I will make sure that we can post that on Mighty Network.
Yeah, great. And it looks like Xander already beat you to sharing it in the chat, but we'll also share that on Mighty Networks to make sure everyone has access and knows where to find it.
Thank you, Xander.
Very on top of it. And maybe the last wrap-up question from Peter Hayes. Looking to the future, what questions do you wrestle with the most? So what's ahead?
Well, we're having some impacts there through climate change. That's really spurred some of our interest in the restoration of some of the remnant oaks there. And we're seeing a bit of a species shift there too. This is a valley margin site, fairly dry, and we're having some dieback of conifers, and we're having to rely less on grand fir. We're seeing a lot of that starting to drop out. So that changes the natural regeneration picture a little bit as well. So yeah, climate change and emerging opportunities for restoration.
Absolutely, and something I think we've seen across the Northwest as well. Well, thank you so much, Mark. And I think we will shift and hear from our third presenter. Although, as I'll keep mentioning, if you have other questions, you're welcome to add them to the chat, and we'll make sure to continue the conversation on Mighty Networks after the day's presentations.
Certainly.
So we'll go ahead and shift to CODY. Really my pleasure to introduce CODY DESAUTEL, who is the Natural Resource Director for the Confederated Tribes of the Colville Reservation. Just the most recent hat I know that he's worn there over more than a 20-year career. So CODY, over to you.
Did it come up? Got the whole screen? Perfect. All right. Well, thank you for the previous presentations. I'm going to go a step further on dry site, being on the east side of the Cascades. Just a little context on COLVILLE Reservation over the last even 6 years. So when we talk about silviculture and disturbance-driven landscapes, that's something we've experienced over the last decade especially, but 2 decades, but particularly since 2015. The 2015 fire season, 1.4 million acre reservation, we burned 255,000 acres of it. Had another pretty significant event in 2019 where we had a 45,000 acre fire and cracked 200,000 acres again in the fire season of 2020. So this is something we've recognized for a couple decades and have been working pretty diligently to try to get ahead of, but definitely our fair share of disturbance and a lot of experience on how you deal with that. So, uh-oh, I need my slide. I can figure out, there we go. So tribal perspectives on landscape resilience. So we've gone away from the traditional approach we had looking back to the mid 80s. We kind of transitioned from an uneven age management perspective where the science through much of that century targeted big old trees that we thought were at high risk for mortality, which left us with the same conditions that many have across the West today. Changed that management approach in the early to mid 80s to an even age management scheme targeting diversity of age structures, restoring some of those early cereal species on the landscape, and had a pretty good trajectory through the 80s, even through the 90s up until about the 2000s, and then started to see a pretty significant uptick in fire activity. So at that point, we changed our approach again, and still that approach is flexible today. The more we see impacts with disturbance, with fire primarily, and what the projections are for climate change. So looking at management for landscapes with post-disturbance conditions that are similar to historic conditions. So we've gone away from the approach of thinking that there's the ability to suppress fire in its entirety. I mean, what we see across the West for the most part is very successful initial attack, but the very few fires we lose, and most organizations are 90 to 98% effective at initial attack, but that 2 to 10% they lose burn acres under the absolute worst weather, fuels, conditions. So we have disproportionately high fire severities, and we're trying to avoid that and return those natural disturbance processes back to something they would have been historically. So once we have a disturbance, we're looking for, from again a fire perspective, a mix of low, moderate, and high severity fire. And obviously that's to some extent dictated by the type of fuel it burns in. So in Eastern Washington, if you're in fire regime 4 and 5, those higher elevation lodgepole, subalpine fir type stands, those historically were a high percentage of high severity fire. So we still see that, but we try to manage and mimic those disturbances on smaller scales using silviculture, resetting those stands to more open condition, lower stocking levels, more western large for us here at Colville, to try to create some resilience in those stands so you don't have these vast patches of high severity stand replacement fire. And then in our lower elevations, our mixed conifer stands, we're really trying to return those post-fire to a very mixed severity post-fire conditions, where you have 20 to 30% of it in high severity patches, which would have happened historically, another 20 or 30% moderate severity, and some, but a lower percentage in high severity. And we're looking to seek resource benefits where possible under specific wildfire burning conditions. And this is something we've struggled with because there's a lot of regulatory hurdles to get through. So in a number of different forums I work in across the West, we've looked at how we move away from this full suppression effort during wildfire season to how we create opportunities on the landscape to allow fires to burn more naturally, and that those fires burn on the shoulders of fire season. So in Eastern Washington, we're talking about fires that would occur in, say, June or September, where you can accomplish a lot of resource benefit and not have those same high severity, long-term ecologic impacts that we see of those fires that burn in July and August. Again, a lot of regulatory issues with that, so we've not had a lot of success, but definitely something our management considers and we plan for in the future once we figure out how to jump through those hoops. Another thing that we're very mindful of is protection of our culturally significant places and plants that our tribal membership use. So a lot of our archaeological and cultural resources, I mean, they're finite resources. They've been there for a long time. Really, that's a very protective approach. We make sure that we consider that when we put projects together, that we create space around those resources so that if they have a fire, they're not completely destroyed, or if we have cultural plants that are of importance, we don't eliminate those populations. And where possible, a lot of times you have opportunities to have fire behavior that promotes those cultural resources, those cultural plants, because most of them occurred in a very historic fire regime and they tend to like fire and disturbance. And then forest management that creates a diversity of structure, the appropriate species composition and stocking. So again, this is the transition we made in about the early to mid 80s, where we're really geared towards transitioning that fire to a composition that's more in line with what we saw in our first inventories that we did in the 50s that would have matched what were there in historic conditions. And I've got a few photos that kind of represent that we reduce stocking. Well, we run on a very long rotation at CODY. Most of our stands are on 120-year rotations. So we're trying to mimic those big old stands that would have been here historically, where you don't have a lot of trees per acre, but you have old big trees and of early cereal species composition. So they do very well in disturbance. And we think that's a good model going forward and should react well or be persistent to climate change. So considerations, kind of what drives COVILLE's decision-making process. So first and foremost, today anyways, I don't know if this would have been the case 5 or 10 years ago, but climate change is a huge consideration. And it's a difficult challenge to overcome because we don't know exactly where climate change is bringing us. We recognize that largely that will be driven by policy that's taken at the federal or, international level on greenhouse gas emissions. But we're trying to be mindful of the decisions we make today and how those will be impacted or how the ecosystem will react in the future. So looking at the graphic I have in the upper right, I don't remember the report I got this out of, but I think I've seen it on a number of occasions, but it's a prediction on what we expect increase in burn acres to be over the next 25 to 40 years. And I think this was about 5 years ago I swiped this image. So for COVILLE, that will be a 241 to 428% increase in burn acres. And again, based on what we've seen in the last decade, where we've burned over 500,000 acres on a 1.4 million acre reservation just in the last 6 years, that seems to be holding very true. So along with that, we have increased insect and disease activity, which isn't a big issue for us because that's something that happens at a slow enough pace. Typically, our resource management can get ahead of that. So if we see a mountain pine beetle infestation, we can usually go in and do some type of forest health treatments to remove those lodgepole pine or other species that they tend to be attacking to kind of keep those in check. But they occur more commonly than they used to and in bigger patches than what we've seen historically. Some of the other impacts we have or other considerations we have is available funding. So most of the work that we do on the CODY Reservation is funded by the Bureau of Indian Affairs, and it's a limited amount of funding. If you look at BIA in general compared to the Forest Service, they're funded at about 1/3 of what the Forest Service is on a per acre basis. So it's always important that we make the best use of the funds we have available, but it is a limitation that with more staffing, we could do more. But at this point, outside of Congress taking action to appropriate more funding to the Department of Interior and BIA, we just recognize that's a challenge and look for opportunities to generate revenue where we can to create some flexibility in tribal budgets to add to that capacity. Along with funding as an issue and a limitation, organizational capacity is a limitation. Where we live in North Central Washington, not a lot of people, two of the most economically depressed counties in the state. We really struggle to recruit professionals. We have an aging workforce, especially on the logging and trucking side. We don't have a great model for transition on how we replace those individuals once they retire. So I don't know how we get across that challenge. Through the Intertribal Timber Council, we did develop a workforce development plan. We're coordinating, and Don can speak to this, with a number of other agencies that are facing the same challenges, but organizational capacity is a problem now, and I think it's a problem that's going to get considerably worse in the next decade or two. And we're really hopeful we can find something to motivate young professionals to go into natural resource fields to fill some of these gaps behind. And then the other consideration we have is adjacent land management. So in the lower right, you can see CODY Reservation in the center. Just to the southeast of that is the Spokane Reservation. The green is a whole bunch of national forest. So obviously, those of you that have neighbors know that what your neighbors do influence what happens on your acreage. So we try to work collaboratively with our neighbors. Thankfully, with the big reservation, the amount of edge I have isn't much. But we've also experienced situations, particularly in 2015, where the Tunk Block Fire started on state land north of us, burned onto Forest Service land, and in one north wind event, burned about 70,000 acres on the reservation. Stuff that was really outside of our control, but understanding that what your neighbors do and their resilience will impact your ability to manage fires or manage disturbance in the future. So kind of the two approaches I'll present here. First is vegetation and then fuels perspective. So starting with vegetation, again, we focus on species composition, stocking, addressing those forest health issues as one of our primary drivers in selecting which areas get harvested and what the silvicultural treatments are, protection and promotion of cultural plants, and then diversity across the landscape, whether that's from an age class perspective or a structural perspective. So the two top pictures you see, one is a Harold Weaver photo from the 40s that shows what I think a lot of people reference in the West in general is these really big, really old open pine stands. And that same stand is on the right, and about 2015, I think that picture was taken. You can see the one big pine tree in there is really the only remnant of that old stand, again, largely from old logging practices, but to some extent just because they were old and mortality takes its course over time. So since that picture on the right was taken, we have logged that stand. It's been regenerated, it's been planted, so hopefully we're on a path to return it to that image to the left. Another example, this isn't from COLVILLE, it's from, I think it's San Carlos or White Mountain Apache in the south. But left side is Forest Service ground next door. Right side is tribal land that had been thinned primarily for forest health and fire considerations. But adjacent stands, two very, very similar structures prior to treatment. But obviously the stand on the right, when you're looking at disturbance and resilience to disturbance, a much more resilient stand than what you see on the left side. So again, those are things that we consider when we put our management together. And we'll talk a little bit more about how we arrange those on the landscape to create suppression opportunities going forward. So just a bit more about vegetation. And again, we run on a very long rotation at CODY. So we're really looking for long-term planning. We have 15-year reentry cycles. So we have a certain target of the area of the watershed that we want to treat with every entry. And again, we're looking for that diversity of age classes, species composition, and structure. And our management plan gives us specific goals for what percentage of structure in 5 different types we want in different forest types. So the bottom illustrations just kind of illustrate, starting with a switch in forest management plan objectives in the 80s, what that planning looks like through at least 3 entries. And again, these through 3 entries, you can see we hit the majority of the stands we have in the project area, but that would be a mix of prescriptions as well. So some of those would have been regeneration treatments, some of them would have been intermediate treatments, some of them would have been just stocking management, and some of those early developing stands that are primarily plantations or stands recovering from a disturbance event. And moving on to the fuels perspective. So again, we're mindful of fire regimes, what was naturally occurring, and recognizing that those fire regime 4 and 5 stands were largely high severity, and that they're probably not that far removed from what they would have been historically. Because a lot of what we see in, whether that be British Columbia, Washington, Idaho, Western Montana, especially in the lodgepole stands, a lot of those saw fire approximately 100 years ago. So we're starting to see the effects of that now with mountain pine beetle infestations and large fires in those higher elevations. Fuel loading is also something we consider. So we manage that both through a fuels perspective and through forest management treatments. Top right is a stand, old lodgepole stand, obviously falling apart. It's kind of hit that 80 to 90 years old, starting to see insect activity. Really not many silvicultural options in a stand like that, but in many of the federal stands we see that are similar, those things just kind of tend to deteriorate and at some point burn. For this stand in particular, what we did is went in and did a regeneration cut, and that one was later planted to Western larch, which will be the species that we manage going forward for the next 120 years. And then, of course, fire return intervals. So the bottom right, looking at stands, especially lower in elevation in those mixed conifer scenarios, fire occurred on a very regular interval in those types of stands. So we try to mimic that to the best of our ability, recognizing that we have a lot of limitations with the use of prescribed fire, whether that's wildland urban interface, whether it's smoke management, or just the fact that we have limited staffing and a lot of regulation about how those are carried out. But always mindful of what historic fire return intervals were and how we try to mimic those conditions going forward. And then lastly, just kind of looking at what those fuel treatments do and how those impact post-fire effects. So lower left image is a bark map from both the Tunk Block and North Star fires we had in 2015. A lot of the red you see in the fire to the right, which was North Star, was a lot of that higher elevation lodgepole, subalpine fir type stands. And what we saw when we got lower in elevation and mixed conifer and even shrub steppe to some extent in Tunk Block was that you saw a lessening of fire severity, something much more consistent with what would have happened historically. And really based on the fire regimes, this is probably pretty consistent with what would have happened. Our percentage of high severity fire in North Star was considerably less than fires that occurred on federal land in that same year. So looking at the fuels management tools we have, we do a fair bit of mechanical treatment, especially in those situations where stands are so departed that it's hard to reintroduce prescribed fire and accomplish your goals without an excessive amount of mortality. In many situations, we'll go in with the mechanical treatment first to reduce that fuel loading, and that gives us the opportunity to go into a fire subsequently and maintain those conditions with available funding and burn windows. Bottom right, a good example of a stand that we've got kind of where we want it to manage going forward, and we're utilizing prescribed fire to maintain those conditions. And a lot of times for situations like this, if you can get a stand back to those conditions, the burning becomes very easy. It's something you can accomplish a lot of acres, at a very low risk, a very low complexity, and without a lot of smoke production, which is a problem that seems to plague us in the West as far as getting prescribed fire acres burned. And then wildland fire use, again, that's something I kind of alluded to earlier. It's something that I really think needs to be part of forest management plans going forward, whether that be tribal, state, or federal management plans. We've talked about how you can use pods or potential operational delineations where you're doing work ahead of time. You're being very specific and strategic about where you do forest health treatments, subsequent fuels treatments, and how those create opportunities on the landscape for suppression, or in the case of prescribed fire use, you have opportunities or no places you can catch fires and have some confidence you can let them occur naturally on the landscape. And if you have a change in weather conditions that dictates you go to a full suppression approach, you have those built-in buffers or those built-in suppression lines that you can utilize to take care or take advantage of that opportunity. And again, that's a combination of, for us, both forest health treatments where you're reducing stalking, changing species composition, increasing canopy base height, and adding fuels either next door or after those fuel or forest health treatments that really creates a lot of opportunity from a wildfire perspective. And if you can't stop them at those, you have the next line. And when fire goes through those, we tend to, again, see a significantly lower fire severity than what we do in unmanaged stands. And last, before I get to questions, we always think about the management we do and how that relates to the benefits of other resources. So the Colville Reservation operates under an integrated resource management plan where we think about how forest management, fire management impacts ESA listed species, fish, wildlife, traditional plants like huckleberries in the upper right. So all of those things are considered when we put together these silvicultural prescriptions and how they impact the landscape now and for the remainder of the rotation. So I think that's a pretty unique approach that people look at what happens now and how that affects the forest or the ecosystem of the landscape over a 100-year period. But that's something that I feel has been pretty successful for us. And we've realized a lot of resource benefit across a vast number of resources because of that approach. And with that, I will end and ask for questions.
Great, thank you so much, Cody. We just have time for 1 or 2 questions, but I did see some activity in the chat that I can share. Mark was wondering if you could share the silviculture methods and time frame that you're planning to use to drive the even-aged ponderosa stands back to an uneven-aged structure while also avoiding encroachment from the true fir.
So I don't know that we ever try to get back to an uneven age structure. We try to manage age classes in a stand for 120-year rotation. Then presumably at the end of that 120 years, we would regenerate that stand. But the uneven age component comes because we've got a number of different age classes represented within that watershed. So we don't try to accomplish a mix of species and age classes on every single acre, but across the watershed, they're always represented. So within, say, one watershed, you'll have the number of stands that are at rotation age 120 years, and you'll have some that were just regenerated within the last 5 years, and everything in between, or at least on 15-year intervals. So that's the approach we take to create that heterogeneity and hopefully that resilience across the landscape through time.
Great, and maybe as a final wrap-up question, Owen was wondering what actions are involved in protecting the cultural plants that you mentioned.
When we look at those, we try to consider what promotes those plants. So for the most part, those develop under very regular fire return intervals. So we try to ensure that those areas get a priority for treatment to ensure that if we do see wildfire through there, it's low severity fire. So what we would hope to get is a positive reaction from the cultural plants. If you don't have that happen and you have an untreated stand and high severity fire, the recovery effort's pretty tough, and a lot of those cultural plants are hard to propagate. So again, that's a high priority when we consider what areas get treatment in which entry.
Great, thank you so much, Cody, for sharing this presentation with us. It looks like we're at about time to shift into breakout groups. I did want to briefly share with folks, this will also go in Mighty Networks, but as I mentioned, we did have a 4th presenter today, Cindy Glick, and her presentation is up on YouTube. So I just put that in the chat. That will also go into Mighty Networks, so you'll have access to that regardless if you access that in the chat or not. And with that, I think it's time to turn it over to Colleen to explain how breakout groups will work today.
Thanks, everybody. We're back here again, ready to break out into groups. We have a Google Doc that we will share among all of us. And it's just a long document with the same questions duplicated on each page. So when you go into your breakout room, you will see a little pop-up on your screen that says which room number you're going to. When you get there, have somebody who is going to record notes. Open up this Google Doc shared link that we're putting into chat and find your breakout group number for your room on this document. And then you can just start to record whatever you think we should capture from your conversation. There are 4 questions tonight, so feel free to skip any that you think are a little bit less important or relevant. There's some important questions for us here as coordinators in terms of what do you feel next steps are and what do you need to support your work? And we can continue that kind of conversation in Mighty Networks as well. So you will see the questions and the Google Doc link shared in chat momentarily, I believe. Yep, the questions are there. There's the link. Now Shannon will work the magic and get you all into groups. We will have until 5:30, I'm sorry, 7:30, I'm in Central Time, 7:30, so about 15 minutes to share. Thanks, everybody.
And the goal was really to kind of expand our horizons in forestry and broaden that, with the idea, of course, that through that expansion of our horizon, we see some more innovation and innovation opportunities. And by now, you've probably seen that we presented, at least I know for me, it was quite a different set of insights that I hadn't been familiar with. And that challenged my thinking in many ways. So on day one, of course, my thinking was challenged in cultural view. I have to admit, I considered myself open-minded and experienced. I've traveled all over the world, worked in Chile, South America, and been in Africa in forestry settings, grew up in Europe. And listening to Don and everybody else the last few days, it's just made me humble how narrow my worldview was and how much is out there that I need to learn about to really be able to innovate and move forward. The second day before we explore the world beyond timber on that, and there's lots of opportunities there too that I think as a region we haven't fully explored and taking advantage of. But we also, of course, discussed some of the challenges to make that work. And even today's discussion, we as a group interested in ecological, socially, and economically responsible and feasible forestry, we can't do it alone. The bigger sector has to work along with that, and not just the forestry sector. There is a lot of marketing, public education, and other aspects that have to come into play. And today we kind of explored a little bit, how does people that address some of these issues and integrate these issues, how do they apply it on the landscape, and how do those ideas show up in the landscape? And we've seen some examples, on tribal land and small private landowners, how some of these ideas show up. So I really want to point out this is really a kickoff event on that, and the important part is really for us now to start digesting, and I'm calling on you now, day 4 tomorrow and forward on. We need your ideas and your help to carry this forward. The organizers, you see the list down there. We've come up with something, and already, looking at this chat notes, getting some feedback, it's very clear we had a fairly narrow view when we set this up, and we had to have it. We had limited time. We challenged by the technology, even though, thanks to Shannon and Mara and Colleen, it all worked out very well. But there's just a lot of ideas that kind of came up, a lot of opportunities and that came up along the way. And success really of this summit is if you keep the conversation going and if that then results in innovation on the landscape. So we need you to do that for us, and we, to move forward on that. There are plenty of ideas of what other people would be helpful to bring into the discussion, what other topics that are really important that we didn't cover. We were limited to 3, and clearly, you can pick several other ones to make that work. And then of course, how to communicate this forward. How do we keep the communication going? There are different ways to do that. From, of course, Mighty Network to field visits to, continuing education events within Oregon State University, within all kinds of outfits, at least in the chat. There was a long list of things, and I know in my email, I could spend half of my life just being involved in workshops these days, and I would like to on that. So I have to be somewhat picky, but again, we want to make sure that we keep track of all those. Hopefully within Mighty Network, we'll make those available for you, and you can pick and choose which ones are most important and most insightful for you to do that. But and the next step then would be to think about how we all can be more active. This group that came together on that, we put in some effort to get things done. We'd like to expand the pool on that. So I'd like everybody to think about what can you do to help the ideas moving forward to show up and more responsible forest management in the future. Are you interested in joining this group, or are you interested in hosting a field trip? There are lots of ways how that can happen. You might want to think about, getting your name on mailing lists like the OSU Communication Office with Shannon keeps mailing lists that we inform about opportunities. The Forest Steward Guild has a event website that you can visit, or you can join them as a member. Then you automatically get informed about that. You have emails, at least the people working in public institutions, our email is easy to find, and that's by design on that. So if you want to follow up with some of the organizers, and if you follow up with somebody who you saw in the audience and who made maybe some interesting comments, we encourage you to do that to make it work and move us forward. So that's really, I think, the pitch here at the end is to see this as a kickoff event and think about, you're interested in it enough to show up for this event. Well, can you help us carry this forward and make this work in the future? So we as a group, we've talked about a follow-up event, and you'll get some survey feedback opportunities the next few days here from the Forest Steward Guild and our organizing group. So give us your feedback, what you liked, what you didn't like. Give us your feedback, whether we should do this again, at what sequence, maybe some formatting issues. Hopefully pretty soon we can do it in person, or maybe the region was too big between covering Washington and Oregon, or the west side and the east side, and we end up with subgroups and stuff. So we don't have a clearly designed plan how to carry to the next one. We've discussed a lot of things, and we ended up actually leaving it as we'll let the group kind of drive that a little bit on that. So it's up to you. If you get a lot of interest for certain activities, but certain topics, that will carry forward, while other topics may not get that interest, and so consequently probably won't be pushed forward in that. So I want to thank everybody in the end for participating. I want to especially thank the speakers. And of course, we really need to thank the organizers, and especially the people that helped us with setting this up, with the dealing with the technology and all the things in the background. It's always nice to be an organizer where you stand there, give the big talk in the beginning, big talk in the end. But the real work was done here by Colleen, by Mara, Amanda at the time, and certainly Shannon and Mary. If everything works back and forth, that's because of them. not
And
because
Rowan.
of me on that. So you can give I guess we can clap the hand. If you have a microphone on, I'll give you a thumbs up for all the groups, and you'll get some information from us that encourage you to keep working with us to move forward on that. And so I hope everybody will take advantage of this and make it work. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.